Hello and welcome to Coffee and Control, the podcast where I find fascinating people from within the world of control and convince them to answer all of my questions. I'm your host, Lucy Hodgins, and my guest today is a lecturer at University College London, or UCL. So the first time I properly met this guest was at a UK Control networking event where we were both very lost trying to find the entrance to the building that seemed impossible to get into. So while we were wandering around, I got the chance to chat to her, and then after the event I went away and had a look through her thesis and the papers she's written since. And you guys, this research is so cool. So a bunch of this work I've literally been wanting to make an episode on ever since I started the podcast. So I was so excited to get to speak to this guest about her work. So we met up at the Control 2026 conference back in June and had an absolutely wonderful conversation. If you listened to last month's episode, you will have heard her already talking about the fantastic things she's doing for the control community in the UK. And honestly, it was so nice to be able to sit down and chat to her for an hour or so about her work. So get ready to learn all about network systems, distributed fault detection and isolation, different kinds of cyber attacks, the vulnerabilities of wearable healthcare devices, and a whole lot more with my guest this month, Dr. Francesca Boem.
So I'm Francesca Boem. I'm Associate Professor in Control Systems at UCL, and my research focuses mainly on reliability, safety and security of dynamical systems, and specifically interconnected systems from electrical power networks, water networks, industrial plants, and IoT devices for energy and healthcare applications.
So your PhD thesis was looking at distributed estimation and fault diagnosis for large-scale network systems, right? So the first question is kind of, how did this PhD come about? How did you get interested in control, that kind of thing?
So I started working control mainly because I started doing my master project with the control group in my university, the University of Trieste in Italy. And the project was not related to my PhD research, but of course in that way I was exposed to the research in control, and I've always liked both mathematics. And as an engineer, I got attracted to that aspects, more theoretical aspects, which I like.
If you're interested in the specifics, Francesca's master's thesis was on statistical process control in the iron and steel industry.
And I loved also the creativity that we have in the control field, the fact that you can really bring something new and be not solve the same problem in different ways, of course, also that, but that there is this interaction of many different fields, and you can use a bit of everything and be inspired to create something new. I find it really fascinating. So that's a bit how I was attracted to the control field. Then I must say that the topic of my PhD was definitely inspired by the research activity of my PhD supervisor, Thomas Parisini, who was working in the fault diagnosis area he has been working for many years. And at that point, really, there was a lot of interest on distributed methodologies and distributed systems, and there were major challenges around the coordination of agents, both for estimation and for diagnosis and fault tolerant control. So that's a bit the motivation. And of course, we were thinking about the large-scale systems, as I was mentioning, power networks, water networks, large-scale industrial plants where there are interconnected subsystems that work in cooperation, but it's not possible to solve these estimation and diagnosis problems with a single agent because of communication constraints, but also modeling constraints. the system is too complex to have just one single agent monitoring everything, and therefore you want to have multiple agents. But then what is required to communicate? What is needed to communicate? Can you minimize both communication? What is the important information there? These were the main challenges. So we were working on the design of distributed architectures for monitoring and estimation. And of course, when you introduce communication, in practice for application to industrial and real world systems, you will have challenges related to delays, asynchronous measurements, and problems in the communication. And that was a bit the context of my PhD thesis, where I was considering really starting from the physical world, the plant, the system, the sensors, and how those communicate through the communication networks to these diagnosers, and then how these diagnosers communicate one to the other. So that was, in that moment, it was one of the first, I would say, the first architecture connecting the cyber and the physical layers, especially for the monitoring purposes in the control community.
I've linked Francesca's thesis below if you would like to check it out for yourself. It is very well written and very mathematically thorough, but also explains everything very intuitively, which I really enjoyed. So I noticed that kind of distributed systems and fault detection is something you've worked on a lot throughout your career. Why is this something that interests you in particular?
Yeah, definitely I think that there is a bit of an overarching theme in my career about this problem of detecting anomalies and making systems safe and secure. And I don't know if it is a personal attitude, and I'm a bit a risk-adverse person. I don't know if making things go in the way we want is, or detecting problems is something that I find fascinating. But in any case, I find fascinating this aspect of discovering something that is not evident. So, and I started with the PhD, with the faults, then going on, it was more about problems related to cyber attacks, covert attacks. Nowadays, I've been, in the recent years, I've been focusing more on aspects of reliability of data for learning-based architecture. So it's again detecting if there is something wrong in the data and trying to make the system resilient to these potential problems that might happen and that could be not evident or not easily detected. And recently, one of my collaborators has created this term like we are fault detectives. So I found quite funny that aspect. So the detection, but really since about investigating something that it's not immediately visible. Yeah, that was a bit probably why it was attractive. And of course, when you start looking at the problem, you can find similarities in the different problems that I have explored, but also the specific opportunity that comes from the evolving technologies that we are seeing emerging in the real systems.
So your PhD focused on developing distributed monitoring systems. So I guess you've kind of touched on this already, but why was it important to use a distributed approach when dealing with cyber-physical systems?
Yeah, well, it is when considering these large-scale systems in general. The systems in the real world are evolving and they are becoming more and more interconnected. As we put them the capability to communicate and to interact. Of course, there are major opportunities out there, but there are also challenges in terms both of cooperation, how do we make them cooperate, but also in terms of reliability and resilience. Being more complex and having them interconnected, there is a risk of cascading failures, cascading problems.
Just a quick summary of the difference between distributed and decentralized. So in a decentralized system, the behavior of each subsystem is only dependent on its own state, whereas in a distributed system, each subsystem depends also on a small number of other subsystems. Francesca's thesis assumes that the underlying network system is distributed, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the fault detection system also has to be distributed. There's a diagram on page 4 of Francesca's thesis that visualizes this concept really nicely.
So If we consider decentralized architectures, so every subsystem is monitored, or there is one estimator and it is controlled by a single controller, of course, it looks like an easy design. You are separating all the aspects, but you may risk to miss the effect of the interconnection. And therefore, that's why it's fundamental to consider distributed architectures that can take into account that interconnected behavior, the relationship between the different subsystems or the different layers of the system, and it needs to be incorporated in the diagnosers or in the controllers if we are considering them, of course, distributed control or distributed fault-tolerant control. I think it is one of the key challenges in modern systems, this interconnection that brings the fact that you can coordinate and getting a much better outcome than the single elements. But of course, it comes with all these vulnerabilities in terms of safety, and then thinking about the communication layer, then you could have cyber vulnerability, cyber attacks coming from there as well, which opens another major research avenue.
So I guess you've kind of given an overview already of the kind of general architecture in your PhD. So I kind of wanted to focus on each of the different kind of levels in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the physical system, I was wondering if you could give an overview of like how this was represented and like why you went about that.
So how we were considering the physical system, of course, as in almost any control application, you start with the differential equations. But being the system a large scale, there was quite an easy choice of model the system as a graph. So the interconnection of states and the inputs and modeling the relationships between them. So graph was an almost obvious choice that allows an interesting formulation of many of the systems that we were considering.
I wanted to add a little bit more detail here because as much as representing a differential equation as a graph does make a lot of sense when dealing with interconnected systems, as someone who doesn't have much experience with networks, I did find this whole concept super interesting. So within Francesca's thesis, the system was represented by a nonlinear differential equation made up of 3 parts. So one of these represented the nominal healthy dynamics, another represented disturbances and uncertainty, and then the last part was used to represent the fault dynamics. And Francesca then represented this differential equation as a directed graph where each node represents either a state or input of the system, and the orientation of the edges is used to preserve causality. The full system was then decomposed into a number of local subsystems, each of which has their own local agent responsible for monitoring it. Okay, so in terms of the sensor network, so I guess the first question is why is it important to model the sensors separately from the physical system rather than like modeling them as a whole?
Yeah, so the point is that, of course, the sensor or modern sensors have a physical component, and you might consider that as part of the physical model, but they have also communication capabilities, and nowadays smart sensors could have also computation capabilities as well. And that's why in that framework we decided to separate sensors from the physical layer in order to take into account also the advanced capabilities that were not only physical but also belonging to the cyber layer into account, and it was also a way to consider all the aspects of asynchronous measurements and the time dependence of the sensing devices.
So given that you've got like all of those different sensors, how do you then come up with an accurate estimation of the overall system state?
So the main point there was to use the model, the knowledge that we have from the system, from the physical layer, in order to estimate the current measurements. So we were introducing some kind of virtual sensors that were capable of updating the actual measurement that was taken at a time that could have been different for all the different sensors, and to adapt it to the current time, and therefore that was the common time used by the diagnoser. So each diagnoser would somehow use these virtual measurements in order to create a consistent view of the plant, and then take further estimates that were needed for the fault detection and isolation problem, so for the diagnostic part. One of the main challenges there is taking into account of the uncertainty of this step, of course. And it's the interesting part, I would say, how to deal with the uncertainty in such a complex framework. So you have uncertainty coming from the sensors, so measurement noise, you have the uncertainty due to the clock, all the synchronous, and you need to update, and therefore you have modeling uncertainty in the model that you are using. And of course, then you have the communication between the diagnosers that can have other problems and introducing other uncertainty as well. But yeah, the important point is that the quantification of this uncertainty is absolutely fundamental for the fault diagnosis task, because of the need to set some thresholds for the residuals that come between the difference between the measurements, updated measurements, and the estimates. And the thresholds are fundamental in being able to detect the faults, so being sensitive to these anomalies that are deviations from the nominal behavior. And there needs to be a balance in avoiding too many false alarms. Possibly avoiding all false alarms. And that's how you use the quantification of the uncertainty to make the thresholds, to design the thresholds in an appropriate way that allow you to be useful for monitoring the health status of the system, and not interrupting the service due to false alarms.
So is that related to, because I know in your thesis you were differentiating between like uncertainty and faults. Is that how you were doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a crucial point. Thank you for pointing out. I think the definition of the fault, I think it's a tricky thing that some people, even in the fault diagnosis domain at the beginning, they find it quite confusing. A fault is not any disturbances or the uncertainty. A fault is something that is changing the behavior of the system, and they make the behavior deviate from the wanted, let's say, the designed behavior, which means that something is happening there which is not normal. Uncertainties are normal, it's part of our world. Disturbances are something that happen all the time, and they are part of our incapability of creating models that are perfect. We cannot know completely the real world. There is this part of randomness or uncertainty, but that's not something that in the diagnostic world we want to detect, because that's normal. The fault is really something that deviates from that behavior, and so it's important to distinguish between the two. And it's also the presence of the uncertainty is what makes the fault detection task challenging, because you don't know whether your error, your residual, is due to this uncertainty or if it is due to an anomaly, a fault.
Yeah, I guess that's even more difficult when the fault comes on slowly. Is that right?
Yeah, there are faults that are much easier to be detected. Abrupt faults, especially if they have big magnitudes, of course, it is evident when they happen. If one could just see them observing by plotting the time series, the measurements, you could easily see that there are outliers or something that happens very quickly. That's the easy part. If a fault happens very smoothly, then it's much more difficult to detect. It can be hidden by the uncertainty, by the noise, the disturbances. And also there is an aspect of automating these decisions. So sometimes when looking at the time series, it might seem easy to visualize, that there has been a fault. But actually making sure that how do you automate that decision, it might be difficult because it's not always possible just to customize and set some parameters because they might not hold in all the cases. Yeah.
I've definitely found in my own work, you'll like try and automate something and it works in most cases, but then there's like an edge case that you haven't thought about and it just breaks.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the same. I mean, sometimes I see also students when doing some projects or something, and it looks like, oh yeah, that's easy to detect these things because I set the threshold there. Yeah, and if you have something just slightly smaller, what do you do? Is it that a fault or not? It's the borderline that it's difficult, and that's why you need all the theory and all the analysis, because you don't want to make things that were just in one single case.
Yeah.
Or you want to avoid that as much as possible, of course.
So you mentioned briefly about like fault detection and isolation. So I guess the question is kind of like, how are those two things similar or different? Is it more difficult to isolate where the fault exactly is rather than just detect that there is a fault?
So, well, first of all, detection means to take a decision whether the system is healthy or if there has been a change in behavior. Okay. The isolation part, that there, depending on the papers and research groups, we might have different definitions, but usually it includes the decision on what type of fault is actually happening. In some cases, then we have the fault identification, so you really try to find the model of the fault and understanding the parameters. And then there is the aspect of fault localization, so where has this fault happened in the system. And how difficult all these phases are depends a lot on the application. There are faults very difficult to detect because, as you said, they might be hidden by the uncertainty, by the noise. In some applications, it's quite easy to detect faults, and the isolation, localization part is very difficult. Let me give you an example. So in water networks, the problem of leakage detection. So the literature about leakage detection is quite extensive. There are many methodologies in the literature, not only all adopted then in the real water networks, but anyway, the literature is quite extensive. One of the major problems, one is false alarms, but is due to the sparsity of the measurements. So you have just few measurements and a very big network, which can be modeled by a graph. And then the localization problem becomes quite challenging. And it can still be an open problem in some cases. But yeah, it depends a lot on the specific application, how challenging it is or how difficult it is. And it can depend on the sensors that you have available, so where they are localized. It could be that it's very easy to localize a fault because you might have a sensor which is close to it, so you have a lower uncertainty due to having an accurate sensor there, and it might be more difficult to localize faults that are farther in the system due to this uncertainty. So the uncertainty could also vary in different locations of the system or depending on different states.
So before moving on to work you've done since your PhD, there are a few kind of higher level questions about your experience doing a PhD, I guess. So the first one is looking back at your PhD now, what was the biggest thing that turned out to be a lot more difficult than you thought it would be?
It's a difficult question, I must say. I love doing my PhD, I must say. Of course, it's okay. I think one of the things that are challenging in PhD is the pressure that you have in deadlines for publications, deadlines for submitting the thesis. That's definitely something that can be challenging for any PhD student. Yeah.
Is there anything in your thesis that you'd approach differently if you were doing it today?
I mean, I mean, definitely I would do things different because I don't find that how I solved that exciting anymore. Not exciting anymore. It was exciting at the moment. Now things have changed and I want always to discover something new. So yeah, definitely I would think of different solutions. But I think for at that moment, I'm happy with what I do. So, yeah, but I must say it's not like I would change something. I think for anything that I've done in my life, it was what I did my best in that moment for the situation I was in.
That's good. I definitely have a few things that I'm like, if I was doing it again now, I would not do that. But it's good to hear that
For the PhD at
you
least.
made the right decisions.
Yes.
I guess I got a little bit about kind of applications to microgrids because I know you've written a few papers on those kind of systems. So, like, what are microgrids? Why are they useful? How can they be modeled as a network?
Yeah, so macrogrids are small-scale power grids including storage, generation, and loads. So they contain almost all the elements of the grid, but in a smaller scale. And they are quite an interesting paradigm because they can make the system more resilient, and also they can allow the integration of distributed generation sources in the grid. So having, for example, photovoltaic or other generators distributed everywhere in the country, and going a bit towards that ideal world where you could have a generation in the same place where you have then also the demand for power, and this of course is also to reduce the strain on the distribution network.
So you've worked within the context of microgrids, but also more generally on cyber attack detection. I was wondering if you could give an overview of like essentially how microgrids are susceptible to attack.
Yeah, sure. So microgrids, one of the main points in microgrids is that you can also coordinate the behavior of the different units, being them storage, being them generators and the loads, in order to minimize the cost of operation of the microgrid, but also optimize their, let's say, their resilience to potential faults. In that sense, needing coordination, there is again the use of communication. And since you introduce communication and the access to the cyber layer to communication networks, that opens the way to potential cyber attacks. So malicious agents that could use the network, the communication network, to compromise data or to interrupt the communication of data between the different agents. This can have, of course, different motivations, from wanting to disrupt some service or trying to get an economic advantage with respect to competitors, even just simply an image damage towards different operators or countries or whatever the reason is for the attack. So what we did together also with some of my PhD students was to consider what is the effect of cyber attacks, especially in the distributed architectures that are used for controlling and monitoring microgrids. Microgrids were really like one of the application examples. The architecture can then be extended to any type of distributed control architecture for other applications too, but it was a nice case study where you could see many different potential impacts of the attacks and also study a bit of the methodologies that can be used to detect the attack and to make the architecture resilient to these types of attacks.
We're going to cover this paper in high level in this episode, but if you're interested in learning in more detail about the specifics of this work, I would thoroughly recommend giving the original paper a read. I've linked it below. It is super interesting.
And that's what we did in the framework of the microgrid, where we were assuming that the attack could modify the communication between the different controllers, and so between the diagnosers or detectors as well. And what we found out, which I think it's very interesting, is that the distribution doesn't make the system vulnerable to the attacks, but also something that the attacker a cyber attacker cannot compromise is the interconnection, the physical interconnection between the subsystems. So taking advantage of the physical layer and of the knowledge of the system and of the knowledge of how the different agents, the neighboring agents, interact with the local agent, it is possible to exploit that knowledge to detect the attack that happens on the communication layer. Using this information, you can also develop some resilient architectures for control.
I wanted to add in a little bit of general background on cyber attacks, just to make sure everyone's fully following. So there are a few different types of attacks, and these each require a slightly different approach to attack detection. So the first type is false data injection attacks, which are pretty self-explanatory. The attacker is injecting extra signals to mess with how the system is functioning. Slightly more sophisticated kind of attack is covert cyber attacks, which also involve the attacker injecting signals into the network system. But they do this in a way that cancels out the effect on the measurement, which means it's really hard to pick up on, but it can cause the system to be driven towards unsafe states. And then a final type of attack is replay attacks, which involve intercepting and resending data. And although they seem relatively simple, they can be very hard to detect. We're going to come back to this point a bit later in the episode. Stealthy attacks refer to any type of attack that is undetectable using a particular detection approach. But this means that attacks that are stealthy to one type of monitoring system might be picked up by a differently designed system. And that distinction is one of the key aspects being utilised in Francesca's papers. Yeah, I think the next question I was going to ask was about detectability, which I guess you've kind of touched on already. So I noticed in your initial work in this area, you used a single module, but then that evolved towards using multiple observers to detect attacks.
Yeah, especially in the case of cyber attacks. So attacks are very different from faults, because faults happen have some random nature, and they are not intentional, and they are not trying to hide themselves usually. While cyber attacks are, of course, intentional, malicious anomalies, and by nature, an attacker tends to try to be covert, so to remain undetected. And in this sense, it is, in general, more challenging to detect cyber attacks than faults. One result that we got from our analysis was that by using different types of observers that were considering different information from the physical layer, it was possible to find a mismatch between this information, and based on that, it was possible to detect the attacks. Just to try and clarify, of course, without the possibility to use the equations and the mathematics out there, but one thing that we discovered was that some attacks that were covert at a local level because of the knowledge, because they were exploiting the local model of the system in order to make themselves undetected, they were actually quite easy to be detected by the neighboring agents because of the influence of the physical interconnection that cannot be modified by a cyber attack was different from the communicated information. And therefore there it was possible to have that detection result. So yeah, I think that one of the main an overarching technique in fault detection, model-based fault detection, is the use of redundancy. So analytical redundancy using models that model the nominal system, and you can compare them with the actual system. Or it could be a redundancy that exploits different information coming from different sources, different sensors, and so on. So it's a bit playing a bit with that redundancy to make sure that the attacks are detected.
So the next question is about attack isolation. So I know we've talked already about fault isolation and like the fact that attacks are much more difficult than faults. Is there anything related to like attack isolation that's different from fault isolation that you need to consider?
Well, it's to to be fair, it's quite it could have a long answer in the sense that when talking about cyber attacks, you have also all the, let's call traditional in some sense, techniques that come from computer science and cybersecurity. And the work that we have done, and in general the work that the control community has done in the area of cyber or secure control, I think it adds a layer of security to the existing cybersecurity methods. It's not about substituting those or supremacy of one to the other. It's actually cooperating by adding that additional weapon to defend the system. It's like adding a layer of security. This is the case also for isolation. So what we have seen for microgrids was that, as I said, redundancy in the sense can be used both for detection and isolation. You can try and see whether you have mismatch on one agent and you might not have on the other agent, and based on this analysis you could get some information on where the attack was happening, in which communication channel. So there are things that are in common with the fault localization and things that are different, and it depends again a lot on the specific application you are considering.
Okay, so I think the final, second to last question on attack detection. So one kind of attack that I found very interesting was replay attacks, where the attacker's not changing the data, they're just like recording it and replaying it. So why are these so difficult to detect? How was your paper on this area able to kind of deal with this?
Yeah, well, replay attacks are difficult to detect because they are communicating information which is realistic and that's already inside the noise and the disturbances, so it looks genuine from the point of view of a detector. There are no major changes if they do a smooth repetition of the communicated information. It can be particularly difficult to detect replay attacks in control systems if you are in steady state, because at that point there is not much that changes in your measurements, and if you continue to see that the signals are nice and stable on their steady state, you might be tempted to say everything is going fine, but that's how the attacker can actually exploit. Well, they might cover problems that are happening on the real system, so the real system could deviate from the steady state. There could be faults, there could be a physical attack or something, but from the monitoring point of view, everything remains nice and steady and as expected.
So how was your approach able to deal with those kind of?
Yeah, well, we have investigated a few techniques around there with different papers, different activities, and different applications as well. The architecture that I described earlier was able also to detect some replay attacks, and we gave some conditions for detectability, and it was by exploiting that physical knowledge and that interconnection, the fact that you have multiple agents. We have also done some works using watermarking. So the addition of, let's say, benign noise that looks completely normal from a sensor control point of view, but that can be analyzed to the fact that something has actually changed and it's not what you are actually communicating that is received on the other side of the communication channel.
So moving on now from attack detection to focus more on control. So I know you've written a paper on fault-tolerant control of large-scale systems, which I found really interesting. I really liked reading that. So how was your proposed approach able to detect faults whilst the system was being actively controlled?
Yeah, I think you are referring to the paper related to active fault diagnosis. Yeah. And one of the major problems in fault detection is the fact that the controller is actually hiding the fault. At least in the first stages. Of course, the controller doesn't see the difference between disturbances, noise, and faults. And so it's just trying to compensate the deviations. And in that sense, in the measurements, it could be difficult to see that there is a fault going on. So what we have, there are existing techniques which are called active fault diagnosis, including active detection and active isolation, that exploit the control input to make the presence of some faults more evident. This is something which is not always possible to implement because, of course, you are somehow disrupting the system, even if for short periods, or you might bring it to less optimal, more costly conditions. But for the problem of fault isolation, that's quite interesting because once you have the detection of a fault, at that point you are less interested about performance and you become more interested about safety. Mm-hmm. And the operator might be happy to waste some of the performance in order to maintain the service, the functioning of the system and also the safety of the system. And therefore, one technique that can be used is to modify the input and observe the reaction of the system in order to highlight the presence of different faults. And the point is to design an input that allows you to separate the potential, well, usually it's with reachable sets, depending on the different fault models that could be happening in the system at a certain point. The work that we have been doing is to use this idea, this technique, in a distributed setting, which of course makes things even more challenging because of the interconnection that we have discussed earlier.
So I guess you've kind of talked about this already a little bit, but how was your approach able to ensure that the system is like stable and remains within the desired constraints even in the presence of a fault?
Yeah. Okay, so what we have used is an MPC-based approach where what we did was to consider the different models of faults that are identified. So from the knowledge of the system, it might be possible to know what type of faults can happen in the system, or you are making assumptions that those are the faults that you want to isolate, for example, the most important ones or the most critical ones. And it is possible to design an optimization problem that takes into account of the safety constraints and applies them to all the possible models that you might have. And in the same time, you try to design the input that allows to separate the reachable sets for all the possible fault models. Of course, there you have a problem of potentially feasibility. Because it could be that it is not possible to do that in one step. You might need more steps to separate the different fault models, but you are running against the time because, of course, the fault might push the state towards unstable conditions or outside your safety constraints. So it's a bit of what is done is try to solve the optimization problem as fast as possible to make it feasible by reducing your uncertainty. So trying to find ways to make those sets of uncertainty around the different fault models as small as possible based on the information that you have from measurements, and making the separability faster as possible while maintaining the constraints on safety and potential on recursive feasibility that will allow you then to recover the system if it is possible for the specific fault happening.
Just to summarise and add a little bit more detail here on this work, because this paper is again really cool. So the basic idea is that once the system has detected the presence of a fault, the local controller is put on standby, and instead a probing signal is injected to isolate the fault. And the probing signal is designed to ensure that the resulting system behaviour is consistent with one single type of fault. Once the controller knows what kind of fault has occurred, it can then use that model of the faulty system within model predictive control to ensure the desired system behaviour. Alternatively, if it's a really bad fault, the other option is to just disconnect the faulty subsystem entirely. So the next part of this episode moves away from more traditional fault and attack detection to talk a little bit about AI. So the context for this is that, as I mentioned earlier, this episode was recorded at the Control 2026 conference. And on the first day of that conference, Francesca had been part of a super interesting panel discussion. I think it was meant to be about the real world impact of control, but it ended up diverging very much into a discussion of AI and how we as control engineers should respond to the increasing prevalence of AI. I'll link below the conference special episode that I made on this if you'd like to hear more about some of the points that were made. Okay, so this is kind of an extra section that I added in from hearing you yesterday on the panel session. I wanted to ask about integrating AI into network systems. I know you kind of mentioned briefly that causes various issues. Could you kind of elaborate on that?
Yeah, the use of AI and machine learning based approaches can bring some uncertainty to the system and also potential vulnerabilities. So there has been a lot of work in our community, the control community at international level, around how to make machine learning technique, reinforcement learning based control safe, of course. But there are aspects which are a bit less investigated, related to the reliability of the information that machine learning algorithms and AI-based algorithms are using to take decision for the system. So it's a bit going back into what is the source of information that AI machine learning is using, rather than trying to make these methods more deterministic or confine them around some safety layers.
If you're interested in this more traditional approach to placing safety constraints on AI systems, this came up a few times in the episode I released back in June with Carmo Amo Alonso, and also features heavily in next month's episode. However, Francesca is more concerned with ensuring safety and reliability of the data being used for training and inference of AI systems.
So in that sense, there is an aspect of reliability of the data, both from in terms of is the data complete, accurate, problems with sensors and so on, but also considering the aspect that AI, the fact of using AI usually relates to being connected to some servers, or anyway, are using some communication network to the wider world. And that implies the potential ability to cyber attacks. So an attacker could potentially modify data or get access to the control system at different levels, of course.
So I guess kind of, maybe you've answered this already, but I was going to ask, like, to what extent are failure modes or vulnerabilities of AI systems either similar to or different from traditional engineered systems?
That's a question that, well, the faults and failures mode, of course, do not change in the sense that they belong to the physical layer, and that is not changing for now, at least. But of course, the use of AI is quite extensively being used. AI and machine learning are being used for the detection and diagnosis of faults. And so it is important to take that into account, aspects of reliability, uncertainty quantification of neural network-based predictors or other types of predictors and estimators using AI and machine learning more extensively. So it is not necessarily the architecture change, but as engineers designing the entire system for monitoring and control, the use of AI is again an opportunity, but also takes some potential challenges that we need to address, and are mainly due to the randomness of some of the behavior and uncertainty that we have on the outcome, uncertainty on the predictability of the outcome of these techniques.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going back to yesterday's panel session, there was another thing that you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on, which is that you said that you're currently working on founding a company with your PhD student. Is that right?
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes. Yeah, it's an interdisciplinary project in collaboration also with one of my colleagues from UCL and the PhD student we are co-supervising, and it's in the area of cybersecurity of IoT devices for healthcare applications. So what we are doing is developing a novel communication solution to make the use of wearable devices secure. Current wearable or IoT devices for medical applications is possible to see from the literature, and we have done also experiment in the labs. They are not secure. They are based on BLE communication protocol, and it is quite easy for our PhD student. It's been extremely easy, and he was not an expert hacker. It's been very easy to disrupt the communication. It was very easy to create a DOS attack.
A DOS attack is a denial of service attack, which involves flooding a system with so many requests that its normal functionality is disrupted.
And he has been able to have a man-in-the-middle attack with the injection of false information in the communication between the wearable device and the phone or other devices that they are connected to very easily. And he was coming every time to the lab, and very excited, like, oh yeah, I locked it, and I was always scared, like, oh no.
Francesca and her PhD student wrote up their findings into a paper that discussed exactly how they were able to carry out these attacks. Along with denial of service attacks, Francesca's student Mohammed was also able to implement replay attacks and sniffing, which is where the attacker is able to intercept and read sensitive data.
I think it's dangerous because, of course, compromising the communicated information can be a source of potential safety. I mean, there could be safety issues for the patients, but also thinking about even fitness trackers. There are lots of people that use like blood pressure measurements or heart rate measurements and devices like that can be found everywhere easily. You can buy them from everywhere. They're very cheap. And people are taking decisions based on those measurements. They might decide to run more, drink, stop, whatever they are doing, or accelerate and so on. And they are extremely vulnerable to cyber attacks. And using Bluetooth, someone like 15, 20 meters, or in some cases even more far from the person could modify those readings and could make the person taking decisions that are potentially dangerous for their health. So yeah, we are working on this new solution to secure the communication, and we have filed the patent. We have already secured some funding, initial funding to finalize a prototype. We are doing some market discovery research activities, and yeah, it's very, very exciting. A lot new, it's multidisciplinary, so I'm learning a lot from that, but yeah, and exciting opportunities.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds really exciting. And also, like, it could have a really big impact.
Yeah, we really hope so. It's still early stages, but yeah, we think it has potential, and we got very positive feedback from the first market discovery. We are in an ICURE program funded by the government, and we are doing this exploration also from the market point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got a few quick-fire questions at the end. So, what are you most excited about in terms of the future of distributed control, fault detection, or kind of control more generally, I guess?
Well, I think I'm very excited by all the opportunities coming from AI and machine learning. I think that there are major challenges there that create exciting research questions, but also novel technologies. I'm exploring the problem of fusion control, so energy, and
It's nice to hear that you're excited about control, excited about AI rather than scared about it. Because I know, like, in the panel session yesterday, there were a few people that were not so sure about it.
So, I want to say that I'm excited from a research point of view. As a person, I'm quite scared, not for the research, but I'm really scared for the potential loss of skills that I see in the general population and in the students. So, and relying on something anyway external, which is provided by a company for almost everything, I don't think it's a wise solution. So I'm very scared by AI as a person in this world, but from a research point of view, I think there are major opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, second question, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh, yeah. So I think, yeah, well, two things. One thing is to try and make what makes you happy. So try and choose what you find interesting, what excites you, what makes you happy, and work on that as much as you can, of course. There are always limitations. And the second, also, try and choose the people you work with, to find people you feel good together, that they are calm and people that listen, and not necessarily they need to be the it's not always about the existing skills, but it's also about what can be learned and how you can work together.
I think that's good advice. Are there any fields of control you haven't worked on that would like to, or applications you'd like to work on in future? I think you sort of mentioned this already.
Yes, I think probably one of the sectors that I find most exciting and that where I want to work is about fusion. Mm-hmm. That's definitely an area that I want to explore more as a researcher. And well, I find it quite interesting also the healthcare applications. As I said, I've started working also on that direction. I think it's something definitely timely, and control can give key contributions there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. What's your favourite part of your job?
The favorite part of my job is collaboration. I like working with other colleagues, sharing ideas. Yeah, I like that side.
Yeah. Who is your role model within the field of control or kind of estimation fault detection?
Well, I must say my PhD supervisor definitely has been my role model, and probably is thanks to him that I'm a researcher. Yeah.
And then final question, what's been your favourite paper or project to have worked on?
Okay, so I must say two, can I? Yes. One is a paper, one is a project. My favorite paper has been a collaboration with EPFL and one of my PhD students when I was at Imperial around the problem of cybersecurity of microgrids. It is an exciting problem. It's been very nice to work also with my colleagues. I found it very, very interesting, and yeah, I've been working with the people that were really inspiring, Giancarlo Ferrari Tricati and my supervisor as well. I mean, it's been really nice. And as a project, I must say, my favorite project has been working together with the KIOS Center in the University of Cyprus, where we have been working at the teaming. It's a European project, the teaming project for the development of the Research Center of Excellence in KIOS, and it's been amazing to work together on that project, both because they are really nice people, I must say, at the personal level, but also it was nice to see the different aspects of research, and so not only research, but what's needed to create a research center. So business plans, aspects of innovation, the teaching. So it has been very interesting and made me learn a lot. Yeah.
That's all my questions. Thank you so much for the interview. It's been amazing speaking to you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, in summary, distributed monitoring is essential for large-scale systems to account for the interconnected behaviour between the various subsystems. Fault detection and cyber attack detection share many underlying principles, but cyber attacks are often much harder to detect because they're designed to remain hidden. Different types of cyber attacks often need different approaches to detect them, for example, using multiple observer modules, exploiting knowledge of the physical system, or adding a watermarking signal to detect changes in communication. AI and machine learning offer exciting opportunities for monitoring and control, but also introduce new challenges around data reliability and cybersecurity. And wearable health devices that communicate over Bluetooth are susceptible to a wide range of cyber attacks, but Francesca and her colleagues are working on a more secure solution to protect these devices and the patients that rely on them. That's all from this episode. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I know I have enjoyed making it. Quick note that I'm going to be at the IFAC World Congress in Busan at the end of August, and I am very much looking forward to meeting lots of interesting people. If you're going to be presenting there and you would like to talk about your work on the podcast, feel free to drop me an email. I will leave my email in the description. I'm going to be making a conference special and I want to get interviews with as many interesting people as possible. Also, if you don't want to be at the podcast, but you want to come say hi, I would love to speak to you. Please come say hello. So, the next technical episode of the podcast is going to be with a PhD student about her work on neural ODEs and the intersection between these and control theory. I recorded that a few weeks ago and it was a great conversation, very much looking forward to releasing it. I'm not sure yet whether that will be the next episode that I release or if you're going to get the IFAC conference special first, but there will be something released at the start of September, and until then I hope you have a wonderful month.